"You filthy colored man! Get out before I call the cops!" The woman shrieked, pointing directly at the man in the faded hoodie. The entire luxury car showroom fell dead silent. The manager, in her expensive suit and arrogant demeanor, had just tried to throw out a black man simply because he dared to ask about the most expensive car in the showroom. But the man only smiled, his voice low but filled with power. "You will soon regret those words." Are you curious what led to this moment? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you find this story captivating, share it with your friends and consider following our channel, because tomorrow, we're bringing another special story just for you. Prestige Wheels on the outskirts of Dallas, Texas, was a place for people with money. Lamborghinis, Rolls-Royces, and Bentleys were lined up under bright white lights, polished to such a sheen that you could see a clear reflection of anyone standing before them. The smell of new leather and floor polish wafted through the air, creating the sense that this place was only for the rich. The man who had just stepped through the glass doors didn't fit in at all. He wore a faded gray hoodie, jeans with frayed cuffs, and dust-covered sneakers. He looked like he could be homeless. He had parked his own Bentley Bentayga in a hidden lot a few blocks away, deliberately walking here so no one would notice. The man, around 50 years old, with salt and pepper hair hidden under his hood and wearing cheap-framed sunglasses, entered with a slow gait. He looked around, his eyes sweeping over the gleaming cars, from a brilliant red Ferrari in the corner to a glossy black Rolls-Royce in the center. The showroom was spacious and bright, with sparkling marble floors and price tags displaying numbers that ordinary people could only dream of. He stopped near a Bentley Continental, admiring its smooth paint, then continued toward the reception desk, where a few employees were chatting. Their laughter echoed, but as he approached, the atmosphere shifted. A young employee named Ethan, dressed in a navy blue suit, looked up and smiled out of habit. "Hello, sir. Welcome to Prestige Wheels," he said, his tone polite but lacking enthusiasm, his eyes quickly scanning the man's outfit, the worn hoodie, old jeans, dirty shoes. "How can I help you?" The man nodded, his voice deep and calm. "I want to look at some cars. Anything interesting here?" Ethan nodded, but his gaze lingered on the man's dusty shoes before traveling up to the frayed hoodie. His smile faded, replaced by a look of suspicion. "Yes, we have many beautiful cars," Ethan said, his voice hesitant. "But what kind are you looking for? There are a few sedans over there, moderately priced." He pointed to a corner of the showroom displaying the cheaper cars, his eyes seeming to say the man shouldn't ask for more. The man nodded, as if oblivious to Ethan's attitude. He walked slowly around the showroom, his eyes landing on the glossy black Rolls-Royce Phantom in the center, priced at over $450,000. He turned back to Ethan, his voice still even. "That Rolls-Royce is nice. I want to see it up close." Ethan was stunned, his mouth slightly agape. "The Rolls-Royce," he repeated, his voice full of surprise, his eyes sweeping over the man's worn-out clothes. "That's our top-of-the-line model. I mean, we need to verify financial information before showing those cars." He hesitated, trying to maintain a polite tone, but his eyes betrayed his deep suspicion, as if he didn't believe the man was serious. The man smiled faintly, his voice still calm. "I just want to see the car. Do you need paperwork just to look at a car?" He stepped closer to the Rolls-Royce, his hand reaching out as if to touch the glossy black paint, but he paused, looking at Ethan, awaiting a reaction. Ethan blushed, scratching his head, his eyes darting around. "No, it's not like that, sir. It's just procedure." He glanced around as if looking for someone to rescue him. Let me get my manager. He turned back to the reception desk, his voice trembling slightly. Ms. Carter, there's a customer who wants to see the Rolls-Royce. A woman approached from the back of the showroom. It was Helen Carter, the manager, around 50 with blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, wearing an expensive gray suit. The heels of her shoes clicked sharply on the marble floor, each step exuding authority. Helen prided herself on her ability to read customers, and in her eyes this man wasn't worth a minute of her time. She stopped, her eyes sweeping over him from head to toe, lingering on the frayed hoodie, ripped jeans, and dirty shoes. "What's this, Ethan?" Helen asked, her voice cold, not bothering to look at the man. "This gentleman wants to see the Rolls-Royce," Ethan replied, his voice hesitant, as if he knew trouble was coming. "I was just explaining the procedure." Helen turned to the man, a fake smile on her lips. "Hello, sir," she said, her voice as cold as ice. "I'm Helen Carter, the showroom manager. The Rolls-Royce is a high-end vehicle, not for just anyone to view. Did you have an appointment, or are you just passing by to have a look?" She emphasized passing by with a mocking tone, her eyes scanning his clothes, as if he had just stepped out of an alley. The man felt the contempt but maintained his composure. "No appointment," he replied, his voice even. "I just want to see the car. Is there a problem?" Helen crossed her arms, her smile hardening. "The problem is that a car like the Rolls-Royce is for serious customers only," she said sarcastically. "And looking at you, I can tell you're not our clientele. Do you have any documents to prove your financial standing, or did you just come here to look for fun?" She smirked, her voice dripping with disdain, her eyes fixed on his worn hoodie, as if to emphasize that he didn't belong. The man shrugged, his voice still calm. "I just want to look at the car. I don't need to buy it right away." He stepped closer to the Rolls-Royce, his hand gently touching the glossy black paint, as if testing its quality. "It really is beautiful. I want to sit inside." Helen immediately blocked his path, her voice as sharp as a knife. "Don't touch the car!" she barked, glaring at him. "We have rules, in your state. I don't think you have enough money to even step in here, let alone buy a car. Don't waste our time." She crossed her arms, standing between him and the car, her eyes full of defiance, as if daring him to challenge her. The showroom's atmosphere grew heavy. A few employees stopped their work, glancing over. A middle-aged customer in a suit paused, watching with curiosity. A young couple nearby began whispering, drawn into the drama. The man felt everyone's eyes on him, but he paid them no mind. "I just want to see the car," he said, his voice low but firm, his gaze still on the Rolls-Royce. "What is your reason for not letting me see it?" Helen lifted her chin, her eyes filled with scorn. "The reason, one, look at you, and I know you can't afford it. This place isn't for people like you." She stressed people like you with utter contempt, her eyes flicking over his shabby clothes and his skin color, as if to make her point clear. "If you don't leave right now, I'll call security." She turned to Ethan, her voice sharp. "You call security, now." Ethan hesitated, his hand holding the phone but not dialing. "Ms. Carter," he stammered. "Maybe he just wants to see the car. Do we need to call security?" He glanced at the man, a worried look on his face, sensing something was wrong. Helen spun around, her eyes burning into Ethan. "Are you arguing with me?" she snapped. "Call them now, if you don't want to lose your job." Ethan paled and quickly lifted the phone, but his eyes still darted to the man, as if hoping for a sign to stop. The man stood still, his eyes locked on Helen. "Call security," he repeated, his voice low, as if for confirmation. "Are you sure you want to do that?" Helen scoffed, her voice dripping with mockery. "Absolutely. I've seen dozens of people like you come in, pretend you have money, then disappear. You filthy colored man. Get out now before I call the cops." Her slur echoed, rendering the entire showroom silent. Ethan dropped his phone, his face ashen. Another employee, Sarah, standing nearby, covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. A customer shook his head, whispering to the person next to him. The man stood there, a determined glint in his eyes. He didn't waver, just smiled, his voice low but filled with power. "You will soon regret those words." The air in Prestige Wheels was now like the calm before a storm. Helen Carter stood there, arms crossed tightly, her eyes blazing with fury after she had just insulted the black man, calling him filthy and threatening to call the police. The showroom was dead silent, the eyes of employees and nearby customers fixed on the scene. The man in the worn hoodie stood opposite her, his calmness so profound it was unsettling. His response, "You will soon regret those words," hung in the air like a warning, but Helen refused to back down. With over 20 years of management experience, she was confident she could handle anyone who dared to waste her time. "What are you still standing there for?" Helen snapped, her high-pitched voice echoing through the showroom. "I made it clear you don't belong here. Ethan, call security now. I don't want to see this guy for another second." She turned to Ethan, the young employee near the reception desk, her eyes giving an unforgiving command. Ethan, only 25 and with less than a year on the job, fumbled with his phone. He looked at the man, then at Helen, feeling trapped between two lines. "Miss Carter," he stammered, his voice trembling. "Maybe he just wants to see the car. Do we need to call security?" He glanced at the man, his eyes showing his anxiety, sensing that something was terribly wrong. Helen spun around, her eyes like daggers. "Are you arguing with me?" she quacked, her voice sharp. "Call now, if you don't want to lose your job." Ethan paled and quickly lifted the phone, but his hand was shaking, his eyes still stealing glances at the man, as if praying for a sign to stop. The man didn't move, his hands in his pockets, his calm eyes observing everything from Helen's attempt to maintain control to Ethan's confusion. He said nothing more, just stood there, as if waiting to see how far Helen would go. Inside, a quiet anger was simmering, but he maintained a placid exterior, like a normal customer being treated poorly. Helen smirked, her eyes filled with contempt. "See, no one here wants to waste time on you. With those tattered clothes, you think you can come in here and pretend to be a big shot." She stepped closer, her voice lowered but full of scorn. "I've seen dozens of guys like you walk in, look around, then vanish when it's time to pay. You're not fooling me." The tension in the showroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. A few customers stopped looking at cars, their eyes glued to the scene. A middle-aged man in a gray suit whispered to his wife, both of them watching curiously. A young couple near the reception desk began to murmur, drawn into the drama. Another customer, a woman in her 40s standing near a Bentley, shook her head, clearly displeased with Helen's tone. The man noticed it all, but he didn't care. He just looked at Helen, his gaze calm but sharp. "I just want to see the car," he said, his voice low and clear, as if trying to keep things civil. "If you don't want to help, I can ask someone else." Helen laughed loudly, a dry, mocking sound. "Ask someone else. Who here do you think will waste their time on you? Look at you, a ripped hoodie, dirty shoes. You look like you just came from collecting cans on the street." She crossed her arms, her eyes scanning him from head to toe as if to emphasize her disdain. "This is a luxury car showroom, not a junkyard." You don't belong here." A few nearby employees lowered their heads, clearly uncomfortable but not daring to speak up. Sarah, a young employee with brown hair and a ponytail, stood near the reception desk, biting her lip, her expression worried. She had been watching from the beginning and looked like she wanted to say something, but Helen's icy glare kept her silent. Ethan, still holding the phone, hesitated, his hand trembling, not dialing. "Miss Carter," he said softly, almost a whisper. "Maybe we should calm down. He hasn't done anything wrong." Helen turned on Ethan, her eyes like knives. "Calm down," she snapped. "You think I'll let a guy like this cause a scene here? Call security now, or I'll call the police myself." She pointed a finger at the man, her voice high-pitched. "Did you hear me? I don't want to see you here anymore. Leave now, before things get worse." The man stood still, his eyes never leaving Helen. He kept his calm. But inside, the anger was now burning brighter. He had faced insults like this his whole life, from his days as a boy in Chicago to being doubted in major boardrooms. But he didn't let emotion take over. "I just want to see the car," he repeated, his voice low, as if giving Helen one last chance to stop. "If you won't help, I can ask the person in charge above you. Who's the head of this region?" Helen was taken aback, not expecting this question. "In charge above me?" she repeated, a hint of confusion in her voice, but she quickly regained her arrogant composure. "You think you can demand to see Mr. Sullivan, the regional director? He's not free to meet guys like you." She smirked, her voice dripping with mockery. "You should leave before I lose my patience. This is my showroom, and I decide who gets to stay." The man nodded slowly, as if considering. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, his voice deep. "Good. I want to meet him." He didn't raise his voice, didn't challenge, just spoke like a regular customer making a reasonable request. Helen burst out laughing, but her voice trembled, as if she was starting to feel uneasy. "Are you kidding me?" she said, her voice high. "Mr. Sullivan doesn't come here just because a guy like you asks. Who do you think you are? A man dressed like a homeless person demanding to see the regional director?" She stepped closer, pointing at him, her eyes glaring. "I've said it, you don't belong here. If you don't get the hell out now, I will call the police, and they will drag you out." The showroom was now a bomb about to go off. Ethan, still holding the phone, hesitated, his hand shaking. "Ms. Carter, maybe we should," he began, but Helen cut him off. "Call now!" she shrieked, her voice almost a hiss. Ethan swallowed hard and started dialing, but his movements were slow, as if hoping for something to intervene. Sarah, standing nearby, couldn't take it anymore. She stepped forward, her voice small but trembling. "Miss Carter, I think we should calm down. He just wants to see the car." She glanced at the man, her eyes apologetic. Helen turned on Sarah, her gaze like a razor. "You want to argue with me too?" she snapped. "If you two don't do as I say, I'll make sure you have no place here." Sarah stepped back, her face flushed, but her eyes still flicked to the man, as if to say she didn't agree with Helen. The man stood still, his eyes locked on Helen. He said nothing more, just watched, as if waiting to see how far she would go. Inside, his anger had become a raging fire, but he maintained his calm exterior, like a mistreated customer trying to remain polite. "I just want to meet Mr. Sullivan," he said, his voice low and clear. "If you won't call him, I'll do it myself." Helen laughed mockingly. "Do it yourself? You think you can just call Mr. Sullivan? A guy like you? You don't know where you are." She stepped closer, pointing at him. This is my showroom, and I won't let people like you cause trouble here. She turned to Ethan, her voice icy. What are you waiting for? Call the police now. The man stood there, his eyes never leaving Helen. He didn't respond to the insult, didn't challenge her, just silently pulled an old phone from his hoodie pocket. He quickly scrolled through his contacts, made a call, and said, his voice low but clear, Frank, I'm at the Dallas showroom. There's trouble. Can you get here now? He hung up, turned back to Helen, a faint but meaningful smile on his face. Just a moment, Ms. Carter. Helen was stunned, her expression flickering between anger and confusion. Who did you call? She asked, her voice trembling. You think some stupid phone call will change anything? This is my showroom, and I decide who gets to stay. She pointed toward the door, her voice almost a shriek. Get out now, before things get worse. The air was so heavy you could hear a pin drop. Ethan, Sarah, and the other employees exchanged worried glances, not knowing what was about to happen. A few customers began to whisper, curious about this man. A middle-aged man nearby whispered to his wife, Something's not right. This guy is not ordinary. The young couple by the reception desk stood frozen, their eyes wide, as if watching a thriller. The man stood there, hands in his pockets, his gaze calm but sharp. He said nothing more, just waited, as if he knew exactly what was coming. Helen, though trying to maintain her confidence, began to feel a deep unease. Her eyes darted around, her hands gripping the edge of the reception desk as if to steady herself. You can't scare me, she said, but her voice had lost its conviction. The police will be here, and you will be dragged out. The man smiled faintly, not responding. He just stood there, his eyes locked on Helen, as if watching her dig her own grave deeper. The showroom was now a ticking time bomb, and everyone could feel a storm was about to hit. The entire Prestige Wheels showroom held its breath. Helen Carter stood rigid, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and a flicker of doubt, her voice still trembling after spitting the venomous words, You filthy colored man! Get out before I call the cops! The man in the worn hoodie stood opposite her, calm, his sharp gaze locked on her. His response, You will soon regret those words, was like a slow-burning fuse, making everyone in the room feel the impending storm. Ethan, the young salesman, was frozen with the phone in his hand, his face pale. Sarah, the brown-haired employee, covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. A few nearby customers had stopped browsing, their eyes glued to the scene as if watching a dramatic movie. A middle-aged woman shook her head, whispering to her husband, The way she's talking. This isn't right. Helen, though starting to feel a gnawing unease, tried to maintain her confidence. Regret it, she scoffed, her voice high-pitched but lacking conviction. You can't scare me. She turned to Ethan, her voice sharp. What are you waiting for? Call the police now. She pointed at the man, her eyes glaring. I've already told you this place isn't for guys like you. Get out before things get worse. The man didn't move, his hands still in his pockets, his gaze calm but sharp. He didn't respond to the insult, didn't raise his voice, just stood there like a mistreated customer trying to maintain his dignity. I just want to see Mr. Sullivan, he said, his voice low and clear, repeating his request calmly. If you won't call him, I already have. He'll be here soon. Helen was stunned, her gaze flickering between anger and confusion. Who did you call? She asked, her voice trembling, as if she was beginning to sense something was deeply wrong. You think some stupid phone call is going to change anything? This is my showroom, and I decide who gets to stay. She stepped closer, pointing at him, her voice almost a hiss. You don't belong here, and I will make sure you are dragged out." The air was so thick you could hear a heart beating. Ethan held the phone, his hand shaking, not dialing. Sarah, standing nearby, bit her lip, her expression worried. She wanted to speak up, but the fear of Helen's retaliation kept her silent. A few customers started whispering, curious about the man. A middle-aged man in a gray suit whispered to his wife, "This guy isn't simple. Something is very strange here." The young couple near the reception desk stood still, their eyes wide, as if watching a thriller. Just a few minutes later, the main glass doors of the showroom swung open. A tall, well-built man in a dark blue suit strode in with a confident air. It was Frank Sullivan, the regional director of the Prestige Wheels chain. Frank, with his silver hair and sharp eyes, scanned the room before his gaze settled on the man. "Marcus," he called out, his voice warm but tinged with concern. "I came as soon as I got your call. What's happening here?" The entire showroom froze. Helen's pointing hand slowly dropped to her side. Her mouth hung open, but no sound came out. Ethan dropped his phone on the counter, his face flushing with shame. Sarah covered her mouth, her eyes wide, as if she couldn't believe what was happening. A few customers whispered more loudly, their eyes darting between the man and Frank. The middle-aged woman nearby whispered, "I knew it. This guy is not ordinary." The man walked over, shaking Frank's hand, a slight but meaningful smile on his face. "Thanks for coming, Frank," he said in his deep voice. "Ms. Carter here thinks I don't belong in this showroom. She was about to call the police to have me thrown out." Frank's brows furrowed as he turned to Helen, his eyes as cold as ice. "Helen, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Do you have any idea who this is?" Helen stammered, trying to regain her composure, but her voice trembled. I don't know. Mr. Sullivan, I was just doing my job, ensuring customers are served properly." She turned to the man, her eyes panicked, her voice almost pleading. "Sir, I apologize if I offended you. I didn't mean to. I just thought you—" The man cut her off, his voice soft but sharp. "What did you think, Ms. Carter?" he asked, his eyes locked on her. "Did you think I couldn't afford this car? Did you think I didn't belong here because of these clothes or because of who I am?" He paused, letting his words sink in, but he didn't raise his voice, maintaining the calm demeanor of a mistreated customer. Helen turned pale, her hands gripping the edge of the reception desk for support. I was wrong," she whispered, her voice choked. "I didn't mean to. I just—" The man shook his head, his voice still calm. "I didn't come here for apologies. Ms. Carter, I came here to see how this showroom treats its customers. And what I've seen is deeply disappointing." He turned to Frank, his expression serious. "Gather everyone. I want to speak to them all. Right now." Frank nodded, gesturing for the employees to move to the conference room. "Everyone, in the conference room, now," he said, his tone firm. Helen stood there, as if nailed to the spot, her eyes filled with panic. Ethan and Sarah exchanged a worried look, then hurried after the other employees. A few customers lingered, whispering, curious to see what would happen next. The man walked past Helen without a second glance, but in his mind, the plan was clearer than ever. The Prestige Wheels conference room, with its long wooden table and glass walls, was filled with tension. The employees sat silently, their expressions a mix of anxiety and curiosity. Helen sat at the end of the table, her hands clenched, her face pale, her eyes cast down as if to avoid looking at anyone. Ethan and Sarah sat nearby, both looking bewildered, unsure of what was to come. Frank stood near the door, arms crossed, his serious gaze watching everyone. The man stood at the head of the table, still in his faded gray hoodie, but his presence now silenced the entire room. As if he commanded the very space, he cleared his throat, his deep voice echoing through the room. "Thank you all for being here. My name is Marcus Wright, the largest shareholder of Prestige Wheels, owning 60% of the shares in this showroom chain." He paused, letting the words sink in. The room held its breath, a wave of whispers rippling through. Helen covered her mouth, her eyes wide, her face ashen as if all the blood had drained from it. Ethan and Sarah exchanged astonished looks, their mouths agape. A few other employees whispered, unable to believe their ears. "I came here today as an ordinary customer," Marcus continued, his voice low but clear. "I wanted to know how you treat people who don't wear suits, who don't wear gold watches, who don't fit the ideal customer profile you imagine." He looked around the room, his gaze resting on Helen, not with accusation, but with simple observation. "I was refused a viewing, insulted, and threatened with being thrown out of the very showroom I own, all because of how I was dressed and because of who I am." The whispers grew louder, but Marcus raised a hand, signaling for silence. "I'm not here to single anyone out," he said, his voice still gentle but full of weight. "But we need to talk about how things are done here. If someone like me, a person who can afford to buy this entire showroom, is treated this way, then how must ordinary customers feel? The people who save their whole lives to buy one car, the people who walk in here hoping to be treated with respect." Sarah timidly raised her hand, her voice trembling. "Mr. Wright," she said, her eyes downcast. "Sometimes we're just following procedure. We don't mean to offend anyone." Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "I understand. Sarah, we all have biases, whether we want to admit it or not. But the problem is that you let those biases dictate how you treat customers, and that has to stop." He turned to Helen, his voice firmer, but still not aggressive. "Ms. Carter, do you have anything to say?" Helen looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks, her voice choked. I was wrong, Mr. Wright," she said, almost in a whisper. "I didn't know who you were. I made foolish assumptions. I am sorry. I will do anything to make it right." Marcus looked at her for a moment, as if considering. Then he turned back to the room, his voice deep and powerful. "An apology is a start, but it's not enough. I believe in second chances, but from now on, Prestige Wheels will operate under a new standard: respect, fairness, and inclusion. We will implement training courses to ensure every customer is treated with kindness, regardless of how they look or where they come from." He took a thin folder from his hoodie pocket and placed it on the table. "This is the contract for my share acquisition, signed 3 months ago," he said, his voice even. "I am not just a shareholder, I am the one who sets the direction for this company. And I want Prestige Wheels to be a model for change, not just in Dallas, but nationwide." Helen bowed her head, tears falling onto her hands. "I understand, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I will do better." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "Ms. Carter, for your actions today, you will be suspended for 1 month, without pay, to attend anti-discrimination training. After that, if you can prove you've changed, you may return. But if I see any sign of prejudice, you will no longer have a place here." The room was silent. Helen nodded, not daring to object, her gaze fixed on the floor. Ethan and Sarah looked at each other, their expressions a mix of relief and anxiety. A few employees nodded in agreement, as if realizing the importance of what Marcus had just said. Frank stepped forward, patting Marcus lightly on the shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said quietly, his voice full of respect. "We will change this place, one step at a time." Marcus smiled. For the first time that day, a warm but determined smile. "We don't just sell cars," he said, his voice resonating. "We build trust, and how we treat others is more important than any contract." As everyone left the conference room, Marcus remained, looking through the glass at the gleaming cars outside. He thought about his journey from a boy growing up in the slums of Chicago, insulted and looked down upon, to a man at the head of an empire. Today wasn't just a personal victory, but the beginning of a larger change, a reminder that no one should ever be judged by their appearance or the color of their skin. A week later, Marcus heard that Helen had started her training course, and that Sarah had proactively welcomed a plainly dressed customer with a respect she had never dared to show before. They were small steps, but they made Marcus believe that Prestige Wheels was heading in the right direction. He walked out of the showroom, the Dallas sun shining on his faded hoodie, and he smiled, knowing that this story would be told again and again, not just here, but everywhere. Thank you for following this story. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. If you want to see more inspiring stories about justice and courage, don't forget to follow. We'll be back with another can't-miss story tomorrow.